Well, earlier I spoke to the former Conservative Cabinet Minister Jacob-Rees Mogg, who was knighted in Boris Johnson's resignation honours list. I began by asking him whether he felt the former Prime Minister had been completely demolished by his own colleagues.
Well, I think there's a real problem with the committee because Harriet Harman ought never to have chaired it. Bear in mind the chairman provides the draft, is a key influential figure, and yet she had tweeted...
There's no evidence that she's a key influential figure. That's not true. They just collate the notes, essentially, right? They just collate the notes. That's all they do. And even then, it doesn't really matter because there was a majority of Conservative MPs on the Privileges Committee. So, you know, regardless of what the chair does or wants, she and the other non-Tory MPs can continually be outgunned by the fact that they are a minority on the committee itself. It just doesn't make any. You're literally making shit up because, you know, this is a guy who continually makes shit up as well. Hence why he's such good friends with Boris Johnson.
Her views before she was appointed to the committee. And if you look at the Hoffman principle for another parliamentary committee, that case the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords, the House of Lords decided that because his wife was a member of Amnesty, there was the risk of the appearance of partiality, and therefore the judgment was set aside.
Well,
I think the same applies in this case. She should not have chaired it, and her influence on it affects the whole validity of the report.
But you could have said all of this all the way along. The fact is that now the committee has come up with such a damning sheet of evidence, endorsed, I might say, unanimously by all four Tories on the committee. This is not just Harriet Harman's judgment, this is a judgment cross-party.
I said this as soon as I discovered the tweets had been issued. And there is an issue with the most senior Tory, isn't there?
Right.
Who it now turns out...
Oh, there's a tweet. Is there? Oh, there's tweets now. Did you hear that, chat? There were tweets. Well, in which case we should throw the Privileges Committee report out the window. Kangaroo court, it's been proven. There were tweets. Tweets have occurred in the time since the Privileges Committee was held.
Has not denied being at one of his own parties, a party for his wife's 65th birthday.
But he hasn't misled the House.
No, but he sits in judgment. You can't sit in judgment for the same offence, really, of which you've now found that you're involved.
But do you accept that what is at stake here is misleading the House? It's honesty, it's integrity, it's the supremacy of parliamentary democracy. And in that context, whether Sir Bernard attended a lockdown gathering is not as crucial as whether he misled the House.
It's really important because it comes to the credibility of the report. And the report loses credibility on two grounds. One is on the ground of Harriet Harman, who should have recused herself, and the second is Bernard needs to come out and say this is not true to re-establish his credibility. Because if he was attending a party for his wife's 65th birthday...
You said he hasn't attended parties. He didn't attend any lockdown parties, he said.
Yes, but he then didn't deny that he was at this particular event.
But is it not pretty ropey, actually worse than ropey? It's dangerous, isn't it, that you and your allies and Boris Johnson are dismissing a forensic 108-page report as, and I quote, a charade, tripe, they're a kangaroo court, they're deranged. This isn't a Trumpian attempt to undermine parliamentary democracy, isn't it?
Simply not, no. Just because it's a long report doesn't make it a good report. That is the sort of very straightforward view of any document.
But is it tripe?
I'd like to hear which evidence Jacob thinks is wrong. Because we literally have direct testimony from people inside Number 10 during the time in which the parties were taking place. We literally have direct testimony from these people. Is he calling them liars in defence of Boris Johnson, of all people? Again, someone, as we've already pointed out on stream today, who was kicked out of the Tory party in 2004 for lying. Like...
Is it rubbish? Is it deranged?
Well, let me answer your question. But the issue here is, do we have freedom of speech? How does our parliamentary system work? It works on an adversarial system. One member stands up, the next member stands up and says this is wrong, this is not right. You are absolutely free in our democratic system to criticise politicians, to criticise the systems they used, to criticise the reports they produce. If you were to say...
So this is, again, where we get this incredibly dumb, rightoid conception of free speech, where it stops being about, you know, whether or not you're being clamped down on by the state, whether the power of the state is being used to silence you for the things you say, and it's just whenever there's a consequence, right? Boris Johnson said something and then there was a consequence. Oh, this is fucking, where's my freedom of speech gone? I'm like, yeah, he was free to criticise the Privileges Committee. He's not being arrested for criticising the Privileges Committee. But what they have done is say, well, if you're going to impugn the parliamentary sovereignty, no less, that you campaigned so hard on Brexit for. Once you'd realised, that Brexit was a thing that was politically convenient for you to be able to support, because he'd already been a Remainer up until the Brexit vote happened, and he realised he could pounce on that populist surge to be able to divide the Tory party, to be able to get himself into a position of leadership within the party as well, right? And that was the whole point. That was literally the whole point. And again, no one is arresting him for lying, for saying the things he said about the Privileges Committee. They are merely saying he's merely facing consequences for his actions.
That everything the House of Commons did was perfect, you would have to say it was contempt of Parliament to dislike the Dangerous Dogs Act, which would be absurd.
OK, but you like to talk about parliamentary sovereignty. You've staked your career on parliamentary sovereignty, and yet now something comes out of Parliament that you don't like, and most people condemned in that way would accept the judgment and go and serve their time or whatever needs to happen.
I'm fully supportive of parliamentary sovereignty. I believe in active.
And there's a big difference, right? Even the things that Jacob-Rees Mogg is saying here, and the things that we've heard from other MPs up until this point about the scrutiny that the Privileges Committee went through and the judgment that they made, right? They're well within the rights to completely disagree and say, I think that the judgment that was made was incorrect. I think they didn't go through, scrutinise the evidence properly. You can say all of these things, you can make all of these criticisms freely and not get the same pushback that Boris Johnson did. The real issue to all of this is Boris Johnson literally saying that calling it a kangaroo court, calling these, all it is the diatribe he made in The Spectator, talking about the kind of capricious nature that he believes the Privileges Committee was under. Which, to be fair, again, they're all more than half of them were Tories, so that doesn't really hold water anyway, regardless. And the fact they're trying to overthrow Brexit when there were loads of Brexiteers on the panel as well. And the things what he did and the way that he said it, and with such vitriol that he used, there were abusive messages that were sent from Boris Johnson supporters to the people who are on the committee, right? And that's the real thing that he is being scrutinised for, that he's being reprimanded for. Is if he wants to say I disagree with the decision, I think that it was the wrong decision, whatever, right? But he's thrown his toys out the pram. He's having a temper tantrum, and then calling all of his mates, going, "Oh no, these people were mean to me. Can you come beat them up, please?" That's what he's saying. Again, it's the actions of a petulant child.
Parliament is the highest law in the land. I haven't questioned the right of Parliament to issue this report. I merely said this is a bad report. The two things are different concepts.
The committee's accused its critics of attempted intimidation. Have allies of Boris Johnson attempted to smear members of the committee by putting about stories about their conduct, their personal life?
Not that I'm aware of.
Would you condemn that if it had happened?
You are absolutely entitled, as I have done, to criticise the committee and to criticise the chairman for chairing the committee and having a position that to my mind was entirely improper when she had expressed her views beforehand. But intimidation is always wrong. Mm-hmm.
So smearing members of the committee, spreading personal stories and rumours, you condemn that?
Well, smearing people is a bad thing to do. I'm not in favour of smearing people. This doesn't mean that if Bernard Jenkins was at a party, that isn't a relevant factor. That's not a smear. If that is true, and he hasn't denied the specific question, if that is true, that is a relevant factor.
How much support do you think Boris Johnson has?
Yeah, it's such a relevant factor. I agree, Jake. It's so relevant, right? I think they should reduce the punishment from 90 to 89 days. There you go. That factor that you've just put out there, that's been factored in now. It's been weighted, and we've decided that we'll take away a day of the punishment for you, based upon its weighting against all the other stuff on the other side that's led to the high level of suspension.
In that place now.
Well, I think in the country at large, he maintains considerable support. He is still. Why are we talking about this? Because he is still the biggest.
He literally doesn't. He doesn't have support at all. YouGov have polled it, and it was like 65% of respondents said that he lied, and he knew that he lied. We know full well that the Boris Johnson supporters of him as a person, right, are a vast minority of the public. These people are addicted to lying and making shit up on the fly. without even realising the words that they're saying. Because because again, post-truth politics at this point, they've gone so far through the looking glass that why not? They get away with it. They get away with it every single time. So why would they stop now rather than just go? I reckon. I'll just say this thing that I'm just going to make up on the spot, and no one's going to question me over it.
Figure in our country, in the House of Commons, his support within the Conservative Party is less than it was, but he never had more than about half the support of the Parliamentary Conservative Party, even when he won the leadership back in 2019.
Do you think he's finished politically?
Oh no, I think oddly this has helped him. They've gone too far. They have found against him on some things that are completely unreasonable, that the stuff about when he walked to the flat, he must have known. Unless you're in somebody's mind, you can't say what people must have known. This is pure speculation. 90 days is a vindictive.
It goes back to what I was saying when I was actually watching the original Privilege Committee hearing, right? It goes back to exactly what I was saying then, which was like, okay, brilliant. Do we think that I could give you the benefit of the doubt that he might not have known that he was breaking the rules. He might not have known that these things were in violation of the lockdown restrictions, right? It's very, very plausible he might not have known. If that is the case, then all you're proving that he is literally fucking dumber than a paramecium, thicker than a bag of rocks, right? Which, to be fair, he is. But I think both can be true as well. I think he can know that and also be a moron. If your admission is, well, our Prime Minister was too dumb, he was too much of a gigantic moron to understand the rules that he himself set, then, clearly he's not fit to be Prime Minister. He's not fit to be fucking in office. He's that stupid that he can't follow his own rules, his own very simple rules. But again, as Enkife points out in chat, right, all these people are so privileged, as I mentioned in my short earlier on today, right? All these people are so privileged, they're all from the same backgrounds, they're from the same schools, they know all the journalists, they are accustomed to this life of completely unearned privilege, just by birthright, by the groups of people that they hang around in, and the echelon of society that they occupy, right? They're so privileged, they just think that everything is beneath them. They think that acting like everybody else is beneath them, and they're so accustomed to it that finally being called out it's an affront to them. There must be some other way. There must be some mistake here. I can't believe you've served me the prole dinner rather than selling me the establishment dinner. What's going on here? Right? There seems to be some mistake. You're supposed to treat me differently to everybody else, and we've been treated like just any normal Tom, Dick, or Harry, right? And I'm like, yeah, exactly. Of course you have, because you are just a member of the public. You're just a member of the public, like anybody else. And again, and as the woman from Question Time, all those 13 years ago, this is now, this woman from Question Time went viral, and so she should have done. They work for us. We pay them. We pay their fucking bills. They're there to represent us. And they're laughing in our fucking faces.
Addictive level of penalty, even though he's left, so it becomes irrelevant. But they've over-egged their particular pudding and made themselves look vindictive, and actually therefore help Boris Johnson. It's reinvigorated his supporters.
And if he does make a comeback?
I'd also like to point out as well that Jacob-Rees Mogg is also lying again about the general public thinking that the committee was fair or not, and that the wider public go 47% to 20% in favour of thinking that he was given a fair hearing. Like, it's simple as that. And there you go. And there's the result. 69% think that he knowingly misled Parliament, including 51% of Conservative voters. Right? There's just no getting away from the fact that the public are not on his side. The only people on his side are a gaggle of completely fucking demented Conservative supporters and a handful of far-right Tory press sycophants who realise that they're in for a penny, so they must now therefore be in for a pound. It's as simple as that.
Would it be at the helm of the Conservative Party or a new party that he might set up?
Well, he wouldn't have my support if he set up a new party. I'm a die-hard Tory, come what may. He? I hope so. I'm pretty sure he is. So I think he'll come.
And the other thing is, he clearly is not. He clearly isn't. a dyed-in-the-wool Tory is he? He doesn't care what party he's a part of. He's never cared for the party apparatus, continually jumping on the backs of people and stabbing people in the back to get to the position that he was in at the time, and then throwing every single other member of parliament, all of the willing fucking sycophants within the party, the fucking lapdogs that he had in the Parliamentary Conservative Party, that he continually just threw under the bus, used as fall guys for his own failures, right? Just continually, every single time, was always somebody else to blame to save Big Dog, as he put it, right? Whether it was Matt Hancock or Oliver Dowden or all of these people, he was always continually finding somebody else to blame for anything that he did wrong. And it turns out that he excised so many people that there was no one fucking left, and they all quit.
Come back within the Conservative Party.
Nadine Dorries, your colleague, also an ally of Boris Johnson, says that Conservative MPs who vote for that report are fundamentally not Conservative and they're risking deselection. Do you agree with her?
That is not how I would phrase myself.
Do you regret that she phrased herself in that way?
I wouldn't dream of telling Nadine how to phrase herself, but I would not ever say anything about how people vote in the House of Commons.
Nadine Dorries has also said in the last few days that her...
I think it's an unserious waffling fuckwit, but I also didn't give the slightest shit about him having some cake and lemonade after work, or the proximity to the funeral, just a complete farce. The Pincher thing is 10 to 20 times more sackable. Oh, I agree. I made this point before you joined in. As far as the scale of things that he's done in his time in the public eye, like, this is not massively high on my list of priorities. I'm just glad that something caught up to him in the end. But obviously, it wasn't even the fact that he broke lockdown rules, which is why he's here. It's lying to the House. Obviously, the fact that we even got to this point to even actually properly scrutinise the lies that he's told is, again, completely farcical, right? It's farcical to the point at which one of the very few good Labour MPs, Dawn Butler, was thrown out of the Commons for saying what we all know now, or we all knew then, but we now have like definitive proof of, and like agreed upon truth amongst not only the general public but Parliament as well, that he absolutely 100% definitely is a liar. And she was thrown out of the Commons for it. Absolute vindication for Dawn Butler. Which is why it's, again, why it's completely fucking stupid that you can't say things like, that you can't actually call people out for lying in Parliament, but there you go.
David Campbell-Bannerman. David, thank you very much. Do you think that Boris Johnson has been victim to a political stitch-up here, or actually is he a demonstrable liar and should never work again?
No, I think it's absolutely disgraceful what's happened. I mean, I gave up my job as an MEP to fight for parliamentary sovereignty, to argue for Brexit. And here we have Parliament being undermined by the action of this committee. I mean, Starlin.
Pretty sure the function of Parliament is what's happened here, right? The function of Parliament is if you lie to the House and you don't correct the record, you can be subject to a punishment. That's just how the rules have already worked and have worked for since the dawn of time with regards to this particular... It doesn't make any fucking sense.
Is what's going on. That kind of punishment is well beyond any sort of alleged crime, and they haven't proven it. You've got this top lawyer, Lord Panic, saying there is no evidence for this. So the whole thing is demeaning, and then you get these alleged allegations now, well, charges, as you just reported, potentially against Bernard Jenkin and the chairman. I mean, what judge would sit there tweeting, I think the defendant is guilty 3 times? I mean, that wouldn't be allowed in the court of law. Their behaviour.
Yeah, true. The Parliamentary Privileges Committee, which doesn't even have the final word, this goes to a vote in the Commons regardless. Yeah. That's the same as a court of law in it. That's exactly how that works.
Is disgraceful.
It's asking someone, and this is, I mean, one of the areas where, for me personally, it all falls down. I can believe that Boris Johnson wasn't running a particularly tight ship. Absolutely. I can believe that throughout all of that lockdown madness, on occasion, Boris Johnson didn't necessarily behave that well. And I can also very much understand why people feel incredibly aggrieved about that. Not going to funerals, distancing at hospitals, etc. So I don't want to try to diminish that whatsoever.
What's interesting as well is that even the GB News hacks, right, the literal paid propagandists by, billion-dollar think tanks, right, the people whose literally only job is to manufacture consent for the Conservative Party, even these people are like, well, I mean, it's not much I can do now, right? All of the bad stuff definitely happened.
But what is happening here is we are asking people who've already expressed the overt opinion that this guy's an out-and-out liar to then judge at the taxpayer's expense whether or not he's a liar. And that's just madness.
Yeah, it is madness.
So if you want to get someone in the country who thinks that man's not a liar, have you considered that literally the only people that you could ask are the members of the Parliamentary Conservative Party who already support him? When literally everybody else all knows that he's a liar. All his supporters all know he's a liar, they just don't care. Oh yeah, I saw that Deacon Quarter. Someone was on Twitter saying that, well, the only reason we know now is because of the incisive questioning of Sir Keith Starmer. And I'm like, come off it, right? The establishment press, the establishment media, the establishment members of the Conservative Party, they'd realised he was no longer electorally useful for the Conservative Party anymore. He had outlived his usefulness as the figurehead of Conservative politics, and so therefore was jettisoned into the dustbin of history, where quite frankly he belongs, that he should have been pushed further up. He should pushed ages ago, right? But as soon as he dropped below Labour in the polls, suddenly it's like, don't want to play with you anymore, right? Your time has finished, your usefulness has been outlived. So they got rid of him and tried to replace him with somebody else.
I mean, the point about this, it's not, he's already apologised for the actions of the government. We've established that Parliament was misled, but it was unwitting. It wasn't deliberate, as this committee has found. And that is wrong, in my view. And they came out with another invented charge, recklessly misled, which it doesn't even have the force of legal backing. So it's the behaviour of this committee.
None of it has the force of legal backing. This isn't a criminal court. This isn't a civil court. This is a privileges committee. That's not how that fucking works.
That has really brought Parliament into disrepute. And that is what we're talking about. It's not about the facts. They've already been established. It's just about whether he deliberately is misled. I mean, it's really very hard to believe he went out of his way to deliberately mislead the House of Commons. And that
do you not think there's something,
in my view?
Do you know there's something fascinating though, David, about this guy who ruffles a lot of feathers? A lot of people didn't like him because of this perceived privilege that he had growing up, and he's a bit of a posho and all of this stuff. A lot of people as well, I think on the left, cannot get their heads around the idea that this guy, who looks a bit scruffy, a bit portly, speaks with a very, very posh accent, goes down so well with the working class. Better than a lot of the...
Except he didn't. The working class voted for Corbyn in 2019. We have the results. The poorest people in the country, they all voted for Corbyn, so it's just not true. I say all voted for Corbyn, the majority voted for Corbyn. So that's just a lie that he's supported by the working class. And it's not. We don't dislike him because of some kind of aesthetic problem with him as a person. We hate him because his policies are garbage. He himself is a charlatan. He's not fit for office. And he has been accustomed to living a life of luxury and living a life of privilege since birth. And again, as I said before, and I will say again, that the reason why all these letters have been sent, all these words have been exchanged, is because he's not used to not getting his own way, and he's throwing a fucking temper tantrum like a spoilt child, a spoilt, petulant little child. I literally could not care less if he was groomed well or not. Just like I couldn't care less if Jeremy Corbyn wore a scruffy jacket. Couldn't give a shit, right? It's the meat of the policies that's the problem, and his conduct as a politician that's a problem.
The Champagne Socialists in the Labour Party. He wins an absolutely stonky majority at the last general election. The mainstream media, and I will just say this, the snivelling lefties that clamber into most of the mainstream media offices on a daily basis, do not like this guy at all. They all want him out, and then there is a massive concerted effort to hammer him in the media, hammer him elsewhere as well, even try to take...
What's interesting is, again, the people who defend this stuff, obviously the media hacks are just following a certain line that they can to try and keep him popular, to try and continue the whatever ideological editorial line that they've got going on. But there's loads of normal people who will kind of say this stuff as well. So all the media, they all had it in for Boris. I'm like, oh, they only had it in for Boris as soon as the polls dropped below, right? As soon as the Tories polled slightly below the Conservative Party, then they kicked into gear, right? Were these same criticisms being levied at Boris Johnson in 2020? Don't think they were, right? It's only in 2021 when all this stuff came out, and suddenly the Conservatives looked like they were starting to lose. Like, oh, okay, well, Boris Johnson's a kind of toxic influence on the Conservative Party's electoral chances. Bam, instantly the press turn on a dime, right? But of course, again, these people are accustomed to having the press on their side the entirety of the time and not having any kind of break in the positive coverage of the Conservative Party and their candidate. And as soon as they get a whiff of press pushback, even when it's being done specifically in the interest of right-wing politics, and suddenly they're like, "Oh no, I can't believe the press! Oh, the press must be swimming him," because again, they have nothing to compare it to. They have no experience of the press genuinely holding the Conservatives to account. So when they do, I'm like, this isn't normal. This isn't normality. Therefore, it must be extraordinary. It must be done as a political hit job rather than, the media establishment knowing exactly what its role is within British democracy, and that is to manufacture consent for right-wing politics, which they can't do if the figurehead for that particular movement at the time is someone who's completely unelectable.
Take the Met Police to court over not doing enough to investigate him, for goodness sake. I mean, when you look at it all like that, do you think people could be forgiven for thinking this is complete and utter stitch-up, and actually quite anti-democratic as well?
It's totally anti-democratic. It undermines, as I say, parliamentary democracy, parliamentary...
Except it doesn't do either of those things, because, the vote was... If the punishment is recommended and then voted upon by the House, right? Parliament is still sovereign in this regard, who could vote down the punishment if they wanted. They can amend the punishment if they want. They can do all of these things, right? It's amendable and also votable, right? It doesn't have to has to pass through parliamentary democracy first. And even then, if it was recommended, right, but after the suspension, there would have been a recall petition, right, which would have to get enough signatures to then remove him from government. And then after that, he would still have to lose the by-election. The subsequent by-election, should enough signatures be reached with regards to the recall petition. So there were plenty of democratic ways that this could have been resolved. But of course, Boris Johnson doesn't want to do that. He doesn't want to admit that people don't like him. So again, and quite shrewdly too, he has decided, nope, well, I'm not going to have the indignity of being voted out personally. So I'm going to go on my own terms, and that allows him to continue this charade, continue this line that he's got going on, that he was somehow hard done by the way in which he's been treated around this kind of stuff. And I'm like, well, to be fair, whatever is bad for the Conservative Party, I'm fine with. If he wants to, take you by his own initiative, throw a nuclear warhead inside the Conservative Party, more power to him, right? Anything that gets me content on this channel, because there's nothing to hope for in this country. Might as well treat politics like a fucking circus that it is in this country. And so, yeah, brilliant, fantastic. I'm glad that he's doing it. But even so, the idea that this is undermining democracy. What undermines democracy is him not allowing vote to go in the Commons, him not allowing there to be a recall petition, is him not allowing there to be a genuine vote in a by-election to prove whether or not he should be representing his constituency. That's what's anti-democratic. Is him removing the democratic processes and just resigning himself, having committed to serving out a whole term, which is something you really kind of have to do when you join up as an MP the first time.
Sovereignty. It really does cause the whole system into question. I think they're going to have to replace the Privileges Committee, have some proper lawyers look at this, with proper legal rules subject to Parliament. This has been hijacked by various political agendas, including on the Conservative side. It's not good enough to say there's 4 Tories. Well, how many of them are actually pro Boris? Actually, like the guy, but Bernard Jenkins seems to have a vendetta.
Well, even then, like, the fact that you think that there should be some kind of particular makeup of any kind of committee in the Parliament based upon whether they have allegiance to your mate in the Commons. that doesn't seem like, again, something that should be happening in the parliamentary democracy that you think has been so impugned by the way in which the committee has presented itself.
Allegedly against him, and the others seem to go along with this. So the whole thing has been appalling, and it is Stalinist.
Yeah, it's pathetic. And actually, you know what? We could have...
Yeah, true. Stalin once, like, during the Great Purge, right? When Nikolai Bukharin was supporting things like the new economic policy, Stalin said, I don't like you, Nikolai, right? I don't like you, so what I'm going to do is get 7 of my mates within the Central Committee to have a discussion and then recommend you being suspended from the Central Committee. And then after 90 days, we'll then let members of one part of the particular Soviet Union have a vote on whether you can stay in your post in the Central Committee or not. That's what Stalin really, that's what he really truly did. And that's not in any way a lie. But that's exactly what happened between Stalin and Bukharin in the Soviet Union. You can't tell me that it didn't, because it did.
It saved everyone a lot of time and a lot of taxpayers' money. I want to know exactly how much this report has cost, because basically this report could have been written in seconds, which is, we think Boris Johnson's a liar, we don't like him, well, let's have a quick chat with him, right, liar. And then that's it. Look, David, we're going to...
But collating the evidence from the people who were there at the same time was the important bit as well. But, you're saying all public money was spent on the committee. What about Boris Johnson's legal defence? I say legal defence, it wasn't a court or anything. But what about, the KCs that were paid for with public money?
The report, I think we owe it to them. There's a very difficult job to be done, and I wouldn't want to get in the way of that. But now I've seen it, I think the sanction really, it seems vindictive, it seems spiteful, and I think overreaching in terms of the sanctions it's got. I think Tom gave a very good comparison there with the other ones, and a lot of it seems to be for having the audacity to criticise them. Now, as members of Parliament, if we can't effectively scrutinise things and speak our mind, then what's the point of us being here?
I mean, a lot of...
Yeah, that is funny, isn't it? How it does seem to be that all the people defending Boris Johnson do indeed have the double-barrelled surnames. Clark Smith, Rees Mogg, Campbell Bannerman.
Of this is, it would seem to be, I mean, away from the misleading Parliament, we'll come to that in a moment, but the rest of it seems to be, or a lot of it, about his reaction on Friday and that remarkable statement he put out. Now, they've got a point there, haven't they? That information released to him on a confidential basis, and he's breached that.
Well, I think he's agreed to go along with the committee. He's been very frank and very open with them in terms of the evidence that he's given and so on with that. And then he's received the draft report before all of us on the Friday, and he's clearly seen that he's not being given a free trial, so to speak, and it's been treated as a trial. It's not a trial, of course. If it were in a court of law, it would have been thrown out straight away. I think there are some very legitimate questions that he's asked. First, about how the committee's comprised. Of course, Chris Bryant had to recuse himself as being chair to start. Since then, Harriet Harman was appointed. There were questions asked about comments that she'd made previously, and then, of course, other revelations coming out as well about members of the committee.
The thing is, you can see what is uniting all of the different criticisms. It's all about all these people on the committee, right? These things that happened outside of the committee. They can't criticise the report, they can't criticise the findings, they can't criticise the length of suspension, they can't criticise any of this because they know that it is watertight in the evidence that's being presented. So they have to go after the people involved, which again is, of course, exactly what the Boris cultists want, because they want there to be some scapegoat, somebody to blame, because that's how conservative politics works.
And again, I respect the work they do. I know it's very difficult, but really they have to accept criticism. And when people don't feel that something is right, they should be able to say that. Now, in terms of confidentiality, one point that I would certainly make on that is that a lot of people feel very well informed about this committee. Why? Because they're seeing it on Twitter. Now, every time the Times or whoever it is tweet about something, they've got that information from somewhere, and that's certainly not coming from Boris Johnson.
In terms of the main crux of the matter, though, deliberately misleading the House, do you challenge that in any way, shape or form?
Well, absolutely, and they must be mind readers because, of course, Boris Johnson's been very clear. He said that the information that was provided to him, he was speaking in good faith to the House, and when more information came through afterwards, as happens with ministers, as has happened with me when I've been other dispatch box, you correct the record. Boris Johnson apologised, correct the record when more information came to light. So what they're saying is really that Boris...
No, but he didn't correct the record. That's the whole point of this fucking process. He didn't correct the record, so much so that he continued saying the same lies throughout the fucking committee.
Has deliberately misled the House, and they think they can understand what he thinks. Now, if you could bottle that, I mean, you'd make a fortune. I mean, if I could understand what my wife's thinking all the time, then my home life would be a lot easier. So how they can say that without any actual evidence and do that as a conclusion, and then this ridiculous 90-day suspension and taking his pass away, it just seems spiteful. It's like the modern-day equivalent of putting people in the stocks and taking them out. So I'm going to vote against this on Monday. I'm going to be speaking out on it, and I'd encourage my colleagues to do the same.
Yeah, but they haven't done it without any evidence, have they? I mean, one of the key witnesses was Martin Reynolds, Boris Johnson's former principal private secretary, who questioned, apparently, how realistic it was for Boris Johnson to say he was told that rules in Downing Street had always been followed.
I can't believe a GB News anchor actually putting a question to a Conservative MP that they then have to actually answer. Wow, what parallel universe have I quantum leaped into?
Martin Reynolds saying that really wasn't a correct thing to say.
Well, there's so many grey areas with everything all the time with guidance, and of course a lot of the time you would say to people that this is what you should do, you need to try your best to work towards it, and of course these were not definitive laws in many cases, and also we have to remember we didn't have one long lockdown that went all the way through. The rules were changing as a constant. Of course we were talking about a workplace environment as well. If we go into say that having an orange juice at your desk is having a party, then what about Durham? What about the other things that have come out in the last day?
Again, like, we have the evidence from the committee. We already know that there was the oasis of normality comments, right? We already understand that this wasn't just an orange juice at the desk, right? This wasn't something that was specific to like future lockdowns, for example, when the restrictions were different. When again, you could probably, under the different restrictions, you could probably, let somebody get away with not understanding what the restrictions were. Apart from the people who wrote the laws for the fucking restrictions, right? Again, all it goes back to is either you believe that Boris Johnson's a liar or that he's literally thick as pig shit. Those are your only two options to that question.
Or two. So I think there's a bit of nitpicking here as well, and applying things to Boris Johnson that aren't really being applied to other people.
Yeah, but it's interesting because, I mean, I imagine there's very little you would agree with Angela Rayner on, but didn't she have a point this morning when she said, look, Boris Johnson should have had a little bit of humility here?
Well, he has. He's been to the Commons, he's apologised on behalf of other people, so for things that he hasn't done, but...
Yeah, writing like a 10,000 word screed where you bawl like a fucking baby about facing scrutiny for the first time in all of your years on this godforsaken planet. That's definitely humility and contrition in my book.
But as the man at the top, really, as Prime Minister, he took responsibility for that, and I think that was the right thing to do there. But I'm sure Angela Rayner, if ever she were hauled in front of a committee, or if any of her colleagues were going through a similar situation, I'm sure she'd hope they were treated fairly and they were treated based on the facts rather than who they are. Now, Boris Johnson, if it's not Partygate, it's about wallpaper or people disliking him for Brexit, of course, and there are people in the establishment
promoting serial sexual assaulters at all? No. Conspiring to beat up journalists? No. Calling Muslim women letterboxes and bank robbers? No. Calling gay men tank top bum boys? No. None of those are going to be the things that you're going to use as examples in this one, Brendan? Did they all just kind of they just forget about these particular incidents that are no doubt worse than any of the things you've said there, or probably worse indeed than the lockdown breaches, right? The whole Chris Pincher thing, which again is the scandal that brought him down, right? It was the Chris Pincher scandal that caused everybody to resign, not Partygate. If you enjoyed this video, please do consider liking and subscribing. It does help out the channel and the algorithm. And if you click the bell notification icon, it will let you know when I go live and when I upload videos. If you'd like to follow me on social media, my handle is @NoJusticeMTG, and that is Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitch, and YouTube. If you want to support my channel in a more financial manner, you can do so by becoming a member for just 99p, by super chatting, or by supporting me on Patreon, with the link is in the description of this video, and hopefully I'll catch you on the next segment.